the execution that never happened, and the family that came from it. I'm going to tell you something I never told you straight. You're old enough now. You've got your own boy, and one day he'll ask you the kind of question you never asked me, because you were smart enough, or careful enough, not to, and you'll need to have an answer that doesn't shame either of you. So here it is. The winter of '87, I was standing in the yard of the Harlan County jailhouse with my hands tied behind me and a rope around my neck. And the only reason I'm sitting across from you right now, drinking this coffee that's too strong and watching your mother move around in the kitchen, is because of a woman I hadn't spoken more than 11 words to in my life. That's where this begins. Or maybe it begins a year earlier, when I rode into Carver Basin with nothing but a bedroll and a claim deed I'd won off a dead man in a card game in Cheyenne. But let's start with the rope. The rope is the part that matters. The morning they walked me out, it was cold in the particular way that high country November gets cold, not the wet cold of the low country that gets inside your clothes, but the dry kind, the kind that turns your breath to smoke before it's even left your mouth and makes the wood of every building look brittle, like it would splinter if you hit it wrong. The jailhouse yard was packed dirt with frost on it. My boots made a sound like breaking glass when I walked. There were maybe 30 people there. Some of them I recognized. The Tull brothers, who were the reason I was standing where I was standing. Cal Prentice, who ran the Carver Basin Cattle Association and had been trying to push me off my quarter section since August. A handful of ranch hands I'd seen at the saloon. A couple of women from the town, the kind who come to watch things like this the way people elsewhere go to church. Not with pleasure exactly, but with a sense that they owe it to the occasion. And at the back of the yard, near the fence, a woman in a dark coat I didn't know the name of, holding a little girl's hand. I didn't think much about her then. A man about to be hanged doesn't spend a lot of time cataloging the audience. What I was thinking about, and I know this sounds strange, but it's the truth, was the claim deed. The one I'd won off Ike Dalloway in Cheyenne. It was folded in my coat pocket. They hadn't taken it when they searched me because Sheriff Breck had done the searching, and Breck had been working for Cal Prentice since before I'd ever heard of Carver Basin, and he'd taken my gun and my money and my knife, but he'd left the deed, which told me either he was stupid or he figured it wouldn't matter once I was in the ground. The deed was for 160 acres in the basin, good grass, a creek, a stand of cottonwoods that broke the wind from the north. I'd spent 11 months on that land, built a cabin, sunk a well, run 40 head of cattle through the summer. It wasn't much. 40 head is nothing. A real rancher would have laughed, but it was mine, and I'd built it from nothing with my own hands. And the thought that Cal Prentice was going to roll it into his operation, the moment they dropped the platform under my feet, made something in me go cold and flat and still. The charge was murder. That was the Tull brothers' contribution. I'd shot Amos Tull in the left shoulder in a dispute over a fence line in October, and Amos Tull had subsequently died, not from the shoulder wound, which was clean and healing fine according to the doctor in town, but from a fever he'd picked up 6 weeks later while riding the high range in the rain. I had nothing to do with the fever. But Walt Tull, who was older and meaner and had always wanted an excuse, took the fever as an opportunity, and Cal Prentice took Walt Tull as an opportunity, and that was the arrangement that had me standing in that frozen yard with the rope around my neck. It wasn't a legal hanging. I want to be clear about that. There was no trial worth the name, 2 days of something that looked like a proceeding, with Judge Elias Coombs presiding, who got his position through Cal Prentice's influence and his whiskey allowance from the same source. The jury was 4 members of the Cattle Association and 2 men who owed Prentice money. The verdict came back in 40 minutes. I'd written a letter to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. The deputy I'd gotten to deliver it, a young man named Hector, who I believe was the only honest person employed by the county at that point, came back 3 days later and told me the letter hadn't made it. He looked ashamed when he said it. He was 22 years old and he couldn't hold my eye. So there I was. The platform was rough pine. New wood, they'd built it special. It still smelled like sawdust, which was a strange thing to notice, but I noticed it. The smell of fresh-cut pine mixed with the frost and the coal smoke coming from the jailhouse chimney. A man named Teague, who'd been hired for the occasion, was standing to my left, checking the knot. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just doing the job. I looked out at the yard. And the woman at the back near the fence, she was looking directly at me. Not the way the others were looking, which was a mixture of satisfaction and the slightly uncomfortable look people get when they're watching something they know isn't right but have decided to allow. She was looking at me the way you look at a problem you're trying to solve. Direct. Assessing. Her jaw was set. I didn't know her name. Later I found out she'd been in the yard for 2 hours before they walked me out, and she'd been talking to anyone who would listen, and most of them wouldn't. And she'd gotten to the deputy marshal from the neighboring county who'd ridden over to observe the proceeding, and she'd spent 40 minutes making a case to him, and he'd told her there was nothing he could do, and she'd gone back to the fence and stood there. Her name was Nora Calloway. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Calloway, had been a homesteader in the basin, a different section from mine, further north, near the tree line, and he died the previous spring of a heart that had been failing since the war. She had 60 acres, a cabin, a milk cow, a kitchen garden, and a daughter named Bess who was 7 years old and had her mother's same set to her jaw. I didn't know any of that. I just knew she was looking at me. Teague checked the knot a second time. Cal Prentice, standing near the front, had his hands clasped behind his back and was watching with the expression of a man completing a business transaction. Walt Tull had his hat off, which I suppose was meant to show respect for his brother, though Amos Tull had been dead 6 weeks by then, and whatever Walt felt about it had long since curdled into something that wasn't grief. Sheriff Breck said something about the sentence of the court. I was watching the woman at the fence. She turned to the little girl beside her, said something in her ear, and the little girl nodded. Then Nora Calloway reached into the bag she was carrying and pulled out a folded piece of paper and walked straight to the front of the crowd. People moved out of her way, not because they respected her particularly, but because she moved like she didn't intend to stop, and people respond to that. She walked up to Sheriff Breck and held the paper out to him. He looked at it like she'd offered him something unpleasant. She said loud enough that I could hear her from the platform, "This is a writ. It came in on the morning stage from Cheyenne. You will read it." Breck didn't take the paper. She said, "Sheriff, read it." He took it. His face did something complicated. He looked over at Cal Prentice. Prentice said flat and certain, "It doesn't change anything." But Breck was reading it, and his face was doing more complicated things, and the deputy marshal from the neighboring county had walked over and was reading it over Breck's shoulder, and the deputy marshal's face had gone very still in the way that faces go when something shifts. The writ was from the territorial marshal. It called for a stay of execution pending review of the proceedings in the matter of Gideon Cal. That's my name, if I haven't told you, Gideon Cal, and the appointment of a proper court-appointed attorney and the re-examination of the evidence. Nora Calloway had sent a letter to the territorial marshal's office 4 days before my letter. She'd sent it by a different route, not through the county deputy, who was compromised, but through the postal rider who ran the high route to Laramie, a man who owed her a favor because she'd fed him through a bad winter 2 years prior. I found all this out later. What I knew then, standing on that platform, was that the deputy marshal from the neighboring county looked at Sheriff Breck and said, "Take him down." And Breck, to his credit or his cowardice, take your pick, did. They put me back in the cell. The writ bought me 30 days, which was enough time for the territorial marshal himself to ride to Carver Basin, and enough time for Nora Calloway to do what she'd apparently been doing for the previous 2 weeks, which was talking to every small landowner in the basin about what had happened to me, and what would happen to them if they didn't act, and enough time for 3 of those landowners to agree to testify about the fence line dispute and the circumstances of Amos Tull's death. The territorial marshal was a man named Aldous Fry. He was 60 years old and he'd been doing the job for 22 of them, and he had a particular kind of patience that is only possible in men who have seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it. He sat across from me in the cell for 2 hours. He asked questions in a quiet, methodical way, and he wrote things down in a small notebook, and when he was done, he sat for a moment looking at what he'd written. He said, "The Tull brothers have 2 outstanding warrants in 2 different counties that I know of, rustling and assault. I don't know how they ended up being the injured party in a proceeding in this county, but I intend to find out." He closed the notebook. He said, "Who wrote to my office on your behalf?" I told him I didn't know. I told him about the woman at the back of the yard. He said, "Mrs. Calloway," not a question. Then, "She's been here 3 times in the past 2 weeks. She is a persistent woman." I said I didn't know her. He said, "You should." He left. 10 days later, the charges were formally dismissed. Cal Prentice was investigated by the Territorial Authority for the next 8 months, which cost him more than a year of revenue in lawyers and bribes to keep himself out of prison, and left him without the appetite or the capital to push anyone else off their land. The Tull brothers left the territory. Judge Coombs resigned. The morning they let me out, it was snowing. Not heavy, just that fine, dry snow that moves sideways in the wind and gets in the crease of your collar and the corners of your eyes. I walked out of the jailhouse with my coat and my gun and my knife and my money and the claim deed, which I put back in my inside breast pocket, and I stood on the boardwalk for a minute, because it is a strange thing to be outside after 30 days inside, even in the snow and the cold, and your body doesn't quite believe it. And then I walked to the livery, got my horse, and rode back to my quarter section in the basin. The cabin was fine. Whoever had been in it and someone had been in it, I could tell by the small disarrangements. A chair moved, an empty flour sack on the floor had left it reasonably intact. The cattle were gone, all 40 head. That was Prentice's work and I couldn't prove it, and recovering them wasn't possible by then. But the cabin was there, the well was there, and the land was there, and it was January, and I had enough put by. I'd buried it under the floorboard near the stove before they arrested me, a habit from the years before I settled, when trusting banks seemed like a luxury, to get through winter and into spring. I spent 2 weeks on the cabin. There were things that needed doing, a section of roof where the snow had gotten under the shingles, a door hinge that had come loose, the well casing that had cracked in the freeze. I worked through it methodically. I didn't think much about the future, because the future was too large and uncertain to think about productively, and I'd found that in my life the best thing to do with a large, uncertain future was to deal with the immediate problem in front of you and let the future come when it came. The immediate problems were the roof, the door, the well casing, and the firewood supply, which was shorter than it should have been for January. I was splitting wood on a Tuesday afternoon. I know it was Tuesday because I'd been keeping account of days since I got out, the way you do when you've been locked up. You start valuing the days differently when I heard a horse. I set the axe down. You learn to do that, to orient toward sound before you know what it is. It's a habit from years of uncertain situations. The horse came around the cottonwoods, and on it was a woman in a dark coat on a gray mare, with a child bundled up behind her on the saddle, the child's arms around the woman's waist. She pulled up at the edge of the yard. I was about 30 feet away with a pile of split wood between us. She said, "Mr. Cal." I said, "Mrs. Calloway." She looked at the woodpile, then at the cabin, the way a person looks at a situation they're evaluating. Then she looked at me. She said, "You're short on wood." I said I had enough. She said, "You don't, not unkind, just certain." The child peered around her mother's arm. 7 years old, with her mother's same dark eyes and the same particular quality of attention, like she was filing things away. I said, "That your daughter?" Nora Calloway said, "Bess, yes." I said, "I owe you something." She said, "You don't owe me anything. I wrote the letter because it was the right thing to do, and because Cal Prentice has been doing this to small landholders in this basin for 4 years, and someone needed to do something about it." I said, "That may be, but you saved my life." She looked at me steadily. She had dark hair, a few strands of gray in it, and a face that had been out in the weather long enough to show it, and she held herself very straight in the saddle the way people do when they've carried a lot and learned how to carry it without showing the weight. She said, "My roof needs looking at, the north corner. Thomas, my husband, was going to do it before he passed, and I've been patching it from inside, which isn't working." I said, "I'll come look at it." She nodded once like that was settled and turned the horse, and she and Bess rode back around the cottonwoods. I stood there with the axe in my hand for a moment. Then I picked up the splitting maul and went back to work, but I was thinking about the roof. I rode up to her place the following Thursday. Her 60 acres were further up the basin than mine, close to the tree line, and the approach was through a stretch of frozen meadow that in spring would be thick with grass and wildflowers. I'd ridden past it in summer and noticed it, the way you notice good land even when it isn't yours. The cabin was smaller than mine, but it had been well built, squared logs, a proper foundation, a good chimney. Her husband had known what he was doing. The north corner of the roof was bad. The shingles had started lifting, and the underlayment beneath them had gotten wet in the fall and frozen, and expanded and cracked. It was the kind of damage that looks minor from inside, but becomes catastrophic if you don't address it, and she'd been right that patching from inside wasn't working. I spent most of the day on the roof. She came out twice, once to bring me coffee, once to ask about something she was hearing in the corner board, whether it was structural. I told her it wasn't, that it was just the wood settling. She accepted that without unnecessary conversation. Bess watched me from the yard for a while. She was a solemn child, not unfriendly, just self-contained. She had a dog, a brown and white thing of no discernible breed, and she and the dog sat in the snow and watched me work. At one point she called up, "How do you know where to put the nails?" I thought about that. I said, "You look for where the wood is solid. You put the nail where something can hold it." She looked at the roof for a while, considering this. Then she went back to the dog. When I came down in the late afternoon, the light was already going flat and cold, the way it does in January in the high country, draining out of the sky before you expect it. Nora Calloway came out of the cabin and looked at the roof, and then at me. She said, "That'll do." I said, "It'll hold through the winter. In the spring you need to replace the whole north section." She said, "I know." There was a silence, not uncomfortable, just the silence of two people who don't require filling in. She said, "Supper if you want." I said I didn't want to impose. She said, "You rode up here and spent the day on my roof in January. Supper isn't an imposition." I stayed. We ate at a table that Thomas Calloway had built, good, solid work, mortise joints, no nails, and Bess sat across from me and ate her stew and asked me after a while where I was from. I told her Kansas, then Texas for a time, then Wyoming. She said, "Do you have a family?" I said, "Not to speak of." She thought about this. She said, "We're a small family. It's just Mama and me." Nora Calloway said, "Bess." Bess said, "It's the truth." I said, "It is." We sat with that for a moment. Outside the wind had come up. I could hear it along the north corner of the roof, and it held, the way a roof holds when it's been done right. That's how it started. Or that's one way to describe how it started. The more accurate thing is that it had already started back in that frozen yard when she looked at me the way she did, and something in me, some part that had been wound tight for years, since before I could name exactly when, registered the look and went quiet. I should tell you about February. Because February is the part that shows you what kind of woman she was before we were anything to each other, when she had no reason to be what she was other than that it was her nature. The storm I mentioned, the one that kept me at her place for 3 days, it wasn't the worst storm that winter. The worst came in the middle of the month, a week after I'd ridden back to my own cabin, and it hit the basin from the northwest and dropped 4 feet of snow in 2 days and killed 3 horses at the Gifford operation and buried the road to Carver Basin under drifts that would have taken a wagon wheels deep. I was all right. I had firewood and provisions and the cabin held against it. But on the second morning of the storm, I woke up at 4 a.m. thinking about her cabin. The north section of the roof I'd repaired was solid. I was confident in the work. But she was up near the tree line, and the tree line broke most of the wind, which meant the snow came down heavy there rather than being pushed sideways. And a roof carrying 4 feet of snow and building more is a different kind of problem than a roof with bad shingles. I lay there in the dark listening to the storm and thinking about the north section, thinking about whether I'd gotten the underlayment flat enough at the seam near the chimney flashing, thinking about the pitch and whether it was steep enough to let the snow slide. By 5 a.m. I was pulling on my boots. It was a bad ride. I won't romanticize it. Birch is a sensible horse and he went where I pointed him, but it was 4 feet of snow and drifting higher in places, and the wind was mean, and I had my face buried in the collar of my coat the whole way up. Took me 2 hours for a ride that in good weather took 40 minutes. I came around the tree line and the cabin was there, dark, smoke coming from the chimney. The roof was holding. I could see from the yard that the snow was heavy on it, but it wasn't carrying enough to be a problem, and the north section was shedding the way it was supposed to. I sat on Birch in the yard in the 4 a.m. dark and 2-hour storm, and felt like a fool. Then the door opened. She'd heard the horse. She stood in the doorway with a lamp hair down, wearing a heavy coat over her nightdress, boots on without the laces tied. She looked at me, then at the roof, then back at me. She said, "The north section." I said, "The north section." She stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. I stabled Birch in her lean-to. When I came into the cabin, she had coffee on and was standing at the stove, still in the unlaced boots and the coat, waiting for the coffee to come up. Bess was asleep in the back room. The cabin was warm, the fire built up. I sat down at the table and took off my outer coat and my hat and my gloves and laid them near the stove. She poured the coffee and set 1 cup in front of me and kept 1 for herself and sat down across the table. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "You rode up here in that." I said I did. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at me. There was something in her face I hadn't seen there before, not softness exactly. She wasn't a soft woman, but something that was the absence of her usual guardedness. The way a face looks when a person has been surprised into dropping a thing they usually carry. She said, "The roof is fine." I said, "I can see that." She said, "You didn't know that when you left." I said, "No." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside the storm was doing its worst, and the cabin was tight against it, and the fire was good. After a while she said, "Thomas wouldn't have come." She said it quietly, matter-of-factly, not with bitterness. He would have thought about it, he'd have worried, but he wouldn't have come in that. I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not criticizing him. It just wasn't his nature. He was a man who worried from a distance." I said, "Some men are." She said, "Yes." We sat there with the storm working at the shutters, and the fire working at the cold, and the coffee getting cooler in our cups. I stayed till the storm broke. 2 more days. I put myself to use. There was always something to be put to use on in a place being run by one person, and she let me without making it a thing. That was one of her qualities, the ability to accept help without either false humility or unnecessary gratitude, to let it just be what it was: practical, mutual, sensible. She needed things done. I was there and could do them. The balance would even out in some form in some time, and there was no need to talk about it or be performative about it on either side. On the last evening of the storm, Bess brought her books out and read aloud to us after supper. She was reading a novel, something by a woman whose name I've forgotten, something about a family in the East, and she read in the particular way of a child who has been reading aloud since she could read, conscious of the punctuation, giving the voices slightly different weights. Nora listened with her mending. I listened with my hands quiet in my lap, which was an unusual position for my hands. When Bess stopped, it was her bedtime. She looked at me and said, "Did you like it?" I said I did. She said, "Mama always likes this part." Nora said, "Go to bed, Bess." Bess went to bed. The fire settled. The wind had dropped an hour before, and the quiet after a big storm has a particular quality, a fullness, like the basin had taken a breath and was letting it out slow. I looked at Nora. She was looking at her mending. I said, "You're doing all right." She didn't look up. She said, "I know." Then after a moment she said, "It's easier now this winter than last." I said, "Good." She said, "Yes." She put the mending down and looked at the fire. Her profile in the firelight was quiet and particular, and I understood that she was a person who had taken in a great deal and processed it privately, and that the small things she said were generally the distillation of much larger things she'd already worked through, and that this was a kind of intelligence I respected more than most. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the snow was releasing from the tree branches, falling in soft masses. You could hear it every so often, that dense, quiet thump. I came up to her place again in February, because there was a storm coming and she had a section of fence down on the south pasture where her milk cow grazed, and the cow couldn't be in open country with the storm she had coming. I fixed the fence. I stayed for 3 days because the storm hit before I could ride back, and in those 3 days I learned that she had been a school teacher in Illinois before she married Thomas Calloway and followed him west, and that she still had all her books, 2 shelves of them along the east wall of the cabin, which I'd noticed on the first visit but hadn't remarked on, and that Bess was reading already. Not just simple words but real reading, sentences, the way a child reads who has been read to every night. I learned that Thomas Calloway had been a good man and a bad farmer, good-hearted, not suited to the physical relentlessness of it, always better with an idea than with a fence post. She said this without cruelty. She'd loved him, and his limitations hadn't changed that, but she'd also carried more of the weight than a marriage ought to require of one person. She didn't say any of that directly. She said enough that I could piece it together, which is generally how honest people talk about complicated things. On the second night of the storm, after Bess had gone to sleep, we sat by the fire. There was nothing particularly dramatic about it. We weren't people who made things dramatic. She was reading. I was working a split in the leather of my saddle with some neatsfoot oil I'd found on her shelf. The fire was doing what fires do. After a while she said, without looking up from her book, "You're planning to rebuild your herd in the spring." I said I was. That I'd need to ride to Laramie and find a seller willing to extend credit against the land. She said, "I have $60. I was saving it for the spring section of the roof, but you could put your name on the north corner and I can patch the rest if you use the 60 toward the cattle." I looked at her. She looked up from the book. Her face in the firelight was direct and even, and she was watching me to see how I'd take what she'd said. I said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because you need it and because you're good for it, and because this basin needs more people in it who can't be pushed off, and you're one of those people." I said, "That's a practical reason." She said, "Yes." A silence. She said, "I'm a practical woman." I said, "I know." She went back to her book. I went back to the saddle. But there was something different in the air of the room after that, some arrangement that had been proposed and acknowledged, and we both knew it was there, and neither of us said anything more about it that night. I took the $60. I paid it back in June when I sold my first cattle, 22 head that I'd gotten credit for in Laramie in March, and pushed through the spring grass and sold at a fair price to a buyer out of Denver. I put the 60 on her table in coin and paper. Exact. She counted it, which I respected her for, and put it in the tin she kept on the shelf above the stove. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank you." That was all. But I've been coming up to her place every week since February by then. Sometimes for a specific thing, the spring roof section, which we did together in April, working from opposite ends toward the middle. A problem with her well pump in May. A dispute with a neighbor to the east about a shared water right that required someone who could speak without losing his temper, which I could, generally, when something was at stake worth staying calm for. Sometimes for no specific reason, except that I'd found myself riding north without having consciously decided to. And then I was in her yard and Bess was coming out to see about my horse, and there was coffee on. Bess had developed an interest in the horse. His name was Birch Gray, with one white sock, and she'd started spending time with him in the way that some children take to animals, seriously and without the nervousness that most people have around a large animal they don't know well. By May she was brushing him herself, which I showed her how to do. She was methodical about it. She did it the right way. One evening in June, after I delivered the repayment after supper, sitting outside because the evenings were warm now, and we'd taken to sitting outside when the weather allowed, Nora Calloway said, without particular prelude, "Thomas has been gone 14 months. I said, "I know." She said, "People in this basin talk." I said, "They do." She said, "They'll talk about this." I said, "They will." She looked at me. The light was long and gold, and it was warm enough that she'd set aside the shawl she usually wore in the evenings. She had her hands in her lap still. She said, "Does that concern you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No." She said, "It concerns me somewhat, for Bess's sake." I said, "That's reasonable." She said, "But only somewhat." I said, "I understand the distinction." We sat there in the long evening light, and the meadow below the tree line was green, and Birch was in the small pasture she'd let me use through the spring and summer, and Bess was somewhere inside reading, and the sound of the creek reached us faintly from down the slope. She said, "If you're going to keep coming up here, I should know what your intentions are." I said, "My intentions are to keep coming up here." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "It's the beginning of one." She looked at me for a long moment. That same direct, assessing look she'd had in the jailhouse yard, like she was reading a situation and deciding whether it was what it appeared to be. Then she said, "All right." That was Nora, all right, like a door opening. I'm telling you this the way it happened, not the way it sounds in stories. It wasn't romantic, exactly, not in the way people use that word. It was two people who'd been carrying things alone for too long and had found, carefully and slowly, that the carrying was possible to share. She was not a soft woman. She had opinions and she expressed them, and some of them were wrong, and when they were wrong she was capable of knowing it, which is rarer than you'd think. She had a temper, kept well in hand but present, and when it came out it was cold rather than hot, that particular controlled fury that is more intimidating than shouting. I found this out in August, when a man named Gifford, who ran a small operation at the south end of the basin, tried to lowball her on the price for winter hay, speaking to her like she was a woman who didn't know what hay cost, and she informed him, in a voice of remarkable steadiness, that she knew exactly what hay cost and exactly what he was doing, and that he could either deal with her honestly or not deal with her at all. He dealt with her honestly. She saw me watching this exchange from the wagon, and afterward, driving home, she said, "You're smiling." I said, "I am." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because that was good to see." She looked at me sideways, then she looked at the road. She said, "Thomas used to handle that kind of thing." I said, "Thomas isn't here." She said, "No." I said, "You did it fine." She didn't say anything, but something in her shoulders settled, and I understood that even capable people sometimes need to hear that they did a thing well from someone who was watching. I should also tell you about July, because July is the part that tells you something about what the basin had become by the middle of that year, and about what standing your ground does to how people see you. By July the word had spread. Not loudly, the territory doesn't do things loudly, generally, but steadily, the way water spreads on a flat surface. The word was that Gideon Cal had been pushed to a rope by Cal Prentice and the Tull brothers and had survived it, and that the territorial marshal had taken an interest, and that Prentice was now spending more time talking to lawyers than he spent on his own land. The word was also, though this was said more carefully, that Cal was up at the Calloway place regular, and had been since February, and that the Calloway widow was a woman worth the association. People started coming to me with things. Not big things at first. A boundary question between two landholders on the east side of the basin who'd been circling a dispute for 2 years and needed someone without a stake in either direction to look at it and say what was fair. I looked at it. I said what was fair. Both parties accepted it, not with pleasure on either side but with the recognition that the answer was sound. Then a man named Aldridge, who ran sheep in cattle country, which in another basin might have gotten him killed, came and asked me to ride with him to a meeting with 3 cattlemen who'd been pressuring him to sell. I rode with him, not to threaten anyone, just to sit in the room and be present, which was enough. I was a man who had been to the end of a rope and come back, and that is a particular kind of authority, not transferable and not faked. The 3 cattlemen said what they wanted. Aldridge said what he had to say. I said very little. At the end of the meeting, the lead cattleman looked at me and said, "We'll leave Aldridge's operation alone." I said, "That's the right decision." He said, not exactly unfriendly, "This basin is changing." I said, "It is." He said, "You're part of that." I said, "I'm trying to be." He nodded once and we left. Aldridge rode beside me on the way back, and after a while he said, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." I said, "You'd have managed." He said, "I'm not sure of that." I said, "I am." He looked at me. I said, "You've been running your sheep in this basin for 5 years against people who didn't want you here. That takes a different kind of backbone than what I've got. I can sit in a room and be still. That's not courage. What you've been doing is courage." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your wife, Mrs. Calloway." I said, "She's not my wife." He said, "Not yet, then. She talked to me in March, after the storm. She told me that I should stay. That Prentice's hold on this basin was breaking and that if the small landholders stayed together they could outlast it. She had numbers, actual numbers written out. She'd been tracking which landholders Prentice had bought out or pushed out going back 4 years, and what their acreage was, and what his actual operating capacity was. And she showed me that his operation was overextended, and that he was in debt to a bank in Denver, and that the hold he seemed to have on this valley was mostly illusion held together by fear. I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "She didn't tell you." I said, "She told me some of it, not all." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That woman has been fighting for this basin since before you rode into it. Most people don't know that because she does it quietly, but I know it because she came to me in March, and I know it because she went to that yard with the paper in her bag." I rode for a while without answering. Then I said, "I know it." He said, "Good." We rode the rest of the way without talking, which was fine. The basin spread out below us in the summer heat, green and gold, the creek glinting where it curved through the lower meadow, and somewhere in the distance Birch was probably grazing in Nora's small pasture, and Bess was probably reading on the porch. And that particular afternoon was the first time I understood clearly that what I was building was not just a ranch or a rebuilt herd or a reclaimed claim deed, but something larger, something I didn't have the right word for yet, though I found it later. The word was home. I asked her in October. We were on the roof, her south section this time, which had started showing the same trouble the north section had shown the previous winter. And she was handing me shingles and I was nailing, and we were working the way we'd learned to work, which was without wasted motion or unnecessary talk, the comfortable efficiency of two people who'd figured out how to do a thing together. I said, I'd like to marry you. She didn't stop handing me shingles. She said, would you? I said, yes. She handed me another shingle. I nailed it. She said, why? I thought about it. I said, because I'm better at everything when you're somewhere nearby, because Bess deserves a father and I think I could do that job. Because I'd like to go to sleep at night knowing you're not alone on this ridge. She said, that's practical. I said, you're a practical woman. She said, I am. Silence, wind moving through the cottonwoods below. She said, Bess would have to agree. I said, that's right. She said, I'll ask her. I said, all right. She handed me another shingle. We finished the south section. We came down off the roof in the late afternoon, and she went inside, and I could hear the murmur of her voice and Bess's voice, back and forth, for about 10 minutes. Then the door opened and Bess came out and stood at the edge of the porch. She said, will Birch live here? I said, he will. She thought about this. She said, all right. And that was that. The Reverend came out from Carver Basin on a Saturday in November. 2 years and 2 weeks after the morning they'd walked me out into that frozen yard with a rope around my neck. It was a clear day, cold and bright, the kind of cold that makes everything look clean and particular, every fence post and tree branch distinct against the sky. The Reverend was a small man named Hooper, who rode a mule and smelled of pipe tobacco, and conducted the service in a businesslike manner that suited both of us well. Bess stood beside her mother during the service. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, dark blue, and she had her dog sitting on her feet, which the Reverend pretended not to notice. When Hooper was done, he had us sign his register, shook my hand with both of his, gave Nora a nod that contained a great deal of respect, patted Bess on the head once. She permitted this, and rode his mule back toward town. We stood in the yard. Nora was looking out over the basin, the way she looked when she was thinking, and the light was sharp and cold on her face, and her hair had come loose from the pin on one side in the wind during the ceremony. She said, well. I said, well. She turned and looked at me. She put her hand on my arm, her fingers finding the fabric of my coat sleeve and holding it, not tightly, but with intention. She looked at me for a long moment, that direct look, and in it was everything she didn't say in the way that Nora never said things unless she'd weighed them first. The choosing, the seeing, the decision to stand in this particular cold in this particular place, beside this particular man. I covered her hand with mine. Bess said, can we go inside? The dog is cold. Nora said, yes. We went inside. That was 31 years ago. You were born the following November, not quite a year, which is how these things sometimes go, and the Reverend had the grace not to count backward, or if he did, he didn't mention it. Bess has been your sister your whole life, and she's been a better sister than most people get. You know that. What you didn't know was the roof, the rope, the frozen yard, Nora standing at the fence with the paper in her bag, 2 hours early, waiting. I didn't tell you because it wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to be the foundation of your understanding of your mother. Your mother is not a woman to be defined by one action, even that one. She is the woman who built 60 acres into 160, who taught you and your sister to read before you were 5, who dealt with every difficult man in that basin with a calm that I could never quite replicate, who never once in 31 years asked me for anything she didn't need, and never once withheld anything I did. But you asked me once, you were about 12, why I kept the old deed in the tin on the shelf, the original claim deed I'd won off Ike Dalloway in Cheyenne. Why I didn't just put it in the ledger with the others, and I told you I just liked having it out, which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I kept it as a reminder, not of what I nearly lost, of what found me in the middle of losing it. The deed is 160 acres in the basin. The land is good, the grass is still thick in summer, the cottonwoods still break the wind from the north, the creek still runs clean. It'll be yours when I'm gone, yours and Bess's. You know what to do with it. Your mother is in the kitchen right now, and she's been listening to me tell you this story, and she hasn't said a word, which is how I know she thinks it needed telling. When Nora Calloway decides something needs doing, she does it without announcement. When she decides something needs to be left alone, she leaves it alone in the same way, completely and without drama. She'll come in here in a few minutes and she'll refill your coffee and she'll look at me, and I'll know from the look whether I said the right things or left out something important. I usually leave out something. She usually finds a way to let me know. But this is the part that mattered, and I wanted you to have it straight. Not the legend, not the short version, the real one. The morning they walked me out with my hands tied and the rope around my neck, I was watching the yard, and there was a woman at the back, near the fence, looking at me like a problem she was going to solve. And she did. And I spent the next 31 years trying to be worth the solving. That's the whole of it. That's enough.